Champagne always tastes like battery acid when you are pretending to be happy. Kate stared down at the flute in her hand, watching a single microscopic bubble detach from the bottom of the crystal and fight its way to the surface. It popped. Gone. Nothing left but the pale, acidic liquid and the reflection of a woman who felt exactly like that fleeting bubble. She took a sip. It was cold sharp and entirely too dry. Around her, the grand ballroom of the St. Regis hummed with the specific low-frequency buzz of extreme wealth. It smelled of expensive gardenias, roasted truffles, and the sterile tang of dry ice creeping out from under the seafood tower. People did not speak here. They murmured. They leaned in close flashing veneers that cost more than most people's homes, making deals that would ruin lives they would never have to witness. Kate adjusted the strap of her silk gown. It was heavy, a deep sapphire that Demeaned had picked out. Wear the blue, he had said that morning, not looking up from his phone, his thumb swiping rhythmically across the screen. It distracts from your shoulders, makes you look less tired. She hadn't argued. She rarely argued anymore. Fighting Demeaned was like punching water. You exerted all your energy, exhausted yourself, and in the end, the water just flowed right back to where it was completely unaffected. Kate, you're slouching. The voice came from over her left shoulder, smooth, cultured, completely devoid of warmth. Demeaned slid into the space beside her, smelling of Tom Ford cologne and a freshly minted arrogance. He didn't touch her. He just stood close enough that, to an outsider, they looked like a united front. A billionaire and his poised, quiet wife. Kate straightened her spine. The boning in the bodice dug into her ribs, a sharp little pinch of pain that grounded her. "Sorry," she muttered, not looking at him. "Don't apologize, just fix it." Demeaned sighed, adjusting his own cufflinks. They were platinum, a gift from her for their 5th anniversary. He had looked at them, said they were nice, and tossed them in a drawer. Tonight, he was wearing them. Not for her, but because they matched the watch he had bought himself yesterday. The board is watching, and the press is over by the ice sculpture. Look like you belong here for once. Kate's jaw tightened. She tasted copper. She had built his first office. Literally. She had painted the drywall in that cramped, mold-smelling room over a dry cleaner 8 years ago. She had balanced the books when they had $12 to their name. But now he was the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, and she was just the woman who had somehow managed to stick around. "I belong here, Demeaned," she said, her voice low. He finally looked at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. "Of course you do," he said, but his tone was patronizing, the kind of voice you use on a slow child. Then his gaze shifted. The boredom melted from his features, replaced by a sudden electric sharpness. Kate didn't have to turn around to know who had just walked into the room. The air shifted. "Demeaned," Chloe's voice was bright, a melodic chime that sliced through the heavy, pretentious murmur of the ballroom. She wasn't wearing a heavy gown. She wore a slip of emerald green silk that clung to her like a second skin, completely unbothered by corsets or structural support. She looked young. She looked hungry. She smelled strongly of vanilla and something aggressively floral, a perfume that Kate kept finding lingering on the passenger seat of Demeaned's car. Kate's stomach gave a slow, sickening roll. "Chloe," Demeaned said. He actually smiled, a real one crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You made it." "I wouldn't miss it," Chloe purred, gliding up to them. She didn't look at Kate. Not at first. She looked at Demeaned, her eyes locking onto his with a familiar, intimate weight. The merger went through. The papers are signed. I brought the confirmation. Brilliant, Damien breathed, taking a half step toward her. I knew you could close them. You've got the touch. Kate stood there, an island of sapphire silk in a sea of sudden isolation. The merger. The acquisition of the very tech firm Kate had researched, vetted, and proposed to Damien 6 months ago. She had spent nights awake at the kitchen table, highlighters bleeding through balance sheets until her eyes burned. She had handed him the portfolio. He had handed it to Chloe, his new VP of Strategic Development. "Oh, Kate," Chloe said, finally acknowledging her. She offered a smile that was all lips and no eyes. "I didn't see you there. You look comfortable." It was a quiet assassination. Comfortable. Code for matronly. Code for irrelevant. "I'm fine, Chloe," Kate said, her voice flat. She refused to let her voice shake. She gripped the stem of her champagne flute so hard she thought the glass might snap and slice her palm open. She almost wanted it to. A physical pain would be easier to manage than the suffocating humiliation expanding in her chest. Kate was just heading to the table. Damien interjected smoothly, casually dismissing her. "Why don't you go sit down, Kate? Let Chloe and me talk to the press for a minute. Business, you know." Kate stared at him. She looked at the man she had married. He had a small white scar on his chin from when they had built a bookshelf together, and a wrench had slipped. She used to kiss that scar. Now she felt absolutely nothing for it. Just a cold, cavernous exhaustion. She turned without a word and walked toward Table 1. Table 1 was situated directly beneath a massive crystal chandelier that threw fragmented harsh light across the pristine white linen. Kate sat in her designated chair, the heavy silk of her dress pooling around her ankles. The chair was gilded ornate and impossibly hard. A waiter materialized silently, placing a plate of seared scallops in front of her. The smell of garlic and brown butter wafted up rich and heavy, but her stomach instantly recoiled. She picked up her fork. The silver was heavy cold against her warm, clammy skin. She pushed a scallop around the plate, watching the butter congeal. Damien and Chloe arrived 10 minutes later. They were practically radiating heat flush with the adrenaline of flashing cameras and sycophantic reporters. They sat down, Chloe taking the seat to Damien's right. Kate sat to his left. The table filled with board members, executives, and their perfectly manicured spouses. Conversation immediately pivoted to the merger. "Incredible work, Damien," beamed a man with a ruddy face and a watch that cost more than a sports car. "Securing that tech firm changes the entire trajectory of Vanguard." "I can't take all the credit," Damien said, smoothly swirling his scotch. He took a sip, the ice clinking sharply against the glass. He leaned back, expanding his chest. "Chloe was instrumental. She understands the modern market in a way most people just don't." He didn't look at Kate. But the implication hung heavy over the table, a toxic, invisible gas. "Well, it takes a sharp mind," Chloe said modestly, though she was practically glowing. She reached out her fingers, lightly brushing Damien's forearm. A brief, familiar touch. A touch you give someone when you know exactly what they look like, asleep. Damien gave me the freedom to aggressively pursue the target. It's easy to win when you have a visionary leading you. Kate felt a prickle of sweat at her hairline. She took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cold air of the ballroom into her lungs. It didn't help. The walls felt like they were inching closer. Kate, the ruddy-faced man's wife, a woman drowning in diamonds and Botox, leaned across the table. "You must be so thrilled. It means Damien will finally be home more right." Kate looked up from her plate. The woman's eyes were entirely devoid of pity. They were hungry. The women in this circle fed on weakness. They could smell the rot in a marriage from 3 tables away. "Damien is always working," Kate said carefully, her voice remarkably steady. "Vanguard is his priority." Damien let out a short, breathy laugh. It was a cruel sound. "Kate wouldn't know what to do with me if I were home," he said, addressing the table at large. "She's perfectly content managing what was it you did today, Kate? The dry cleaning, the caterers for next week." The table went quiet. A few uncomfortable chuckles sputtered out and died. "I was finalizing the charitable trust documents." Kate said the words tasting like ash. "The ones you neglected to sign." Damien's jaw twitched. The casual smile remained plastered on his face, but his eyes turned to flint. "Administrative work," he said dismissively. "Essential, of course, but someone has to do the heavy lifting." He turned his body, slightly angling himself toward Chloe, and away from Kate, a physical barrier erected in front of an audience of 20. "Chloe, tell them about the restructuring plan." As Chloe launched into a breathless explanation of corporate synergy using bullet points Kate had written, Kate felt a strange sensation wash over her. It wasn't the hot, blinding rage she used to feel when Damien belittled her in private. It wasn't the frantic, desperate need to prove her worth. It was a profound, chilling detachment. She looked at Damien, really looked at him. She saw the expensive haircut, the custom suit, the arrogant tilt of his head. He was a hollow man. He had taken her loyalty, her brains, her youth, and built a pedestal for himself, kicking her down every time she tried to stand beside him. And he was doing it right now, publicly feeding her to his mistress and his board just to inflate his own ego. He needed her to feel small so he could feel big. "Kate, dear, pass the salt," Chloe asked, interrupting her thoughts. Chloe was smiling, her eyes bright and triumphant. It wasn't a request. It was a test, a demand for servitude in front of the executives. Kate looked at the small silver salt cellar sitting between them. She looked at Chloe's manicured hand, extended and waiting. For a fraction of a second, Kate considered tipping it over, letting the white crystals spill across the table. But the utter pointlessness of it struck her. Damien would sigh, call her clumsy, and play the long-suffering husband. Slowly, Kate picked up the heavy silver cellar. She didn't hand it to Chloe. She placed it down onto the table, sliding it exactly 1 inch toward the center, leaving it completely out of Chloe's reach. "It's right there," Kate said softly. Chloe's smile faltered, her hand hovering awkwardly in the air. A tense, suffocating silence gripped the immediate area around them. Damien's head snapped toward Kate, his nostrils flaring. "Kate!" he hissed under his breath, leaning in so only she could hear over the hum of the ballroom. "What is wrong with you tonight? You are embarrassing me." "Am I?" Kate asked, not looking at him. She picked up her water glass. Condensation dripped down her fingers, cold and grounding. "I think you're doing a fine job of that yourself." Damien's hand shot out under the table, his fingers gripping her wrist tightly. It wasn't enough to bruise, but it was enough to trap her. "If you can't behave," he whispered, his breath hot and smelling of scotch, "go home. You're bringing down the entire table. You look exhausted, and honestly, you're acting unhinged." He let go of her wrist, smoothing his tie, and immediately turned back to the ruddy-faced executive, a loud, booming laugh escaping his lips as if nothing had happened. Kate sat frozen. The phantom pressure of his fingers remained on her skin. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap against the sapphire silk. They were shaking, not from fear, from the sudden terrifying realization that she had absolutely nothing left to lose. A spoon clinked sharply against a crystal goblet. The sound echoed through the massive room, cutting off the low hum of conversation. The lights dimmed, leaving only the chandeliers glowing warmly above the tables. Demeaned stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with a practiced fluid motion. He didn't look back at Kate as he navigated his way to the small stage at the front of the room. The microphone whined for a split second before he tapped it, offering his most charming media-ready smile to the crowd. Thank you all for being here tonight. Demeaned's voice boomed through the speakers, deep and resonant. 10 years ago, Vanguard Holdings was just an idea, a sketch on a napkin, a dream. Kate felt her stomach twist violently. A sketch on a napkin. It was a lie. It was a 20-page business plan she had typed on a second-hand laptop while he slept. Today, Demeaned continued pacing the stage, slowly commanding the room. We are a titan. The acquisition we finalized today solidifies our place at the top of the food chain. But a company is only as strong as the people pushing it forward. People who don't just maintain the status quo, but who violently disrupt it. He paused, letting the silence hang. He was a master at this. Theatrics. I have realized recently, Demeaned said, his tone turning intimate, almost confessional, that to reach the next level, you need a partner who matches your drive. Someone whose vision aligns with the future, not the past. Someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty and build. Kate's breath hitched. A terrible, heavy dread pooled in her gut. He wasn't going to do this. He couldn't possibly be this brazen. She looked at Chloe, who was sitting perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on Demeaned. Her lips parted in a breathless, expectant smile. That is why, Demeaned announced, his voice rising, I am thrilled to announce tonight that Chloe Evans is not only the architect of our newest acquisition, but she will be stepping up as the new Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard. The room erupted into applause. Chloe stood up, feigning a look of surprised humility, covering her mouth with her hand before waving to the clapping executives. Kate sat entirely still. The applause sounded like static in her ears. COO. He had just handed the company she built to his mistress. But Demeaned wasn't finished. He held up a hand, waiting for the applause to die down. Furthermore, Demeaned said, his eyes scanning the room, landing deliberately on table 1, landing deliberately on Kate. Vanguard is evolving. We are shedding the dead weight. We are moving away from the cautious, small-minded mentalities that hold corporations back. In business and in life, you must know when to cut your losses and invest in the future. He was looking right at her. The room was dark, but the spotlight caught the cruel curve of his mouth. Thank you, Chloe, he said smoothly, for being the future. More applause. Whispers hissed through the tables nearest to Kate. People were not stupid. They heard the subtext. They saw the public execution of a marriage dressed up as a corporate restructuring. The ruddy-faced executive's wife shot Kate a look of undisguised pity mixed with sick fascination. Kate felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands felt like lead. She was suffocating in the heavy, perfumed air. She had to get out. She had to stand up, walk away, and never look back. But her legs wouldn't move. The sheer weight of the public humiliation had pinned her to the chair. Demeaned stepped down from the stage, accepting handshakes and backslaps as he made his way back to the table. He looked victorious, invincible. Then a sound cut through the murmurs of the room. It wasn't a microphone. It wasn't a clinking glass. It was the heavy rhythmic thud of thick rubber soles hitting the marble floor of the ballroom. Thud, Thud, thud. The sound was entirely alien in the St. Regis. It was the sound of a construction site of a shipping yard of concrete and steel. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, usually reserved for service staff, had been pushed wide open. Standing in the threshold was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and completely out of place. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a faded canvas jacket over a flannel shirt. His jeans were dark-stained at the knees with what looked like dried oil. He had a thick head of graying hair, windblown and messy. And on his feet were a pair of heavy scuffed, steel-toed work boots. Thud, thud, thud. He began walking down the center aisle directly toward the stage. The ballroom fell dead silent. The transition was jarring. 1 second, it was the low hum of corporate back padding. The next, an absolute breathless vacuum. Security guards in black suits materialized from the edges of the room, moving swiftly toward the intruder. "Sir, you can't be in here!" a guard hissed, reaching out to grab the man's canvas sleeve. The man didn't even look at the guard. He simply kept walking, an unstoppable, slow-moving force of nature. The guard grabbed his arm tighter. "Sir, take your hand off me, son," the man said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a gravelly, resonant authority that made the hair on the back of Kate's neck stand up. The guard hesitated, unnerved by the sheer lack of fear in the older man's eyes, and his grip loosened. Damien had stopped halfway to his table. He turned around, a scowl pulling at his handsome features. "Security, get this man out of here. He's obviously lost." The older man stopped. He was 10 feet away from Damien. The harsh light of the chandelier caught his face. He had deep grooves around his mouth, eyes like chipped flint, and a jaw set like a steel trap. He smelled faintly of sawdust, cold rain, and old leather. Kate felt the breath knock entirely out of her lungs. Her fingers dug into the armrests of her gilded chair. It couldn't be. He hated the city. He hated these people. He hadn't left his property up north in 4 years. "I'm not lost, Damien," the man said. The gravel in his voice scraped across the silence of the room. Damien's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He squinted, trying to place the face of the blue-collar worker standing in his $1,000,000 ballroom. "Who the hell are you?" Damien demanded, his voice echoing slightly. "How do you know my name?" The man ignored him. His eyes bypassed Damien, completely sweeping over the crowded tables, the glittering dresses, the terrified, confused faces of the board members. Finally, his gaze landed on table 1. He locked eyes with Kate. For the first time all night, the cold knot of nausea in Kate's chest began to break apart, replaced by a sudden terrifying heat. "Dad," Kate whispered. The word barely left her lips, but in the dead silence of the room it carried. Chloe let out a sharp, confused gasp. Damien's head snapped back to Kate, his eyes wide, then darted back to the man in the work boots. Arthur Reynolds stood in the center of the Vanguard Holdings gala, his rough, calloused hands resting casually in the pockets of his canvas jacket. "Hello, Kate," Arthur said softly, his rough voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present in the room all night. Then he turned his attention back to Damien. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating chill. "You don't know who I am, Damien," Arthur said, taking a slow, heavy step forward. "Because for the last 10 years, you only ever saw my daughter as a stepping stone. You never bothered to look down at the ground you were walking on." Damien let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, trying to recover his composure. He looked at the executives playing to the crowd. Kate's father, a mechanic. What is this, a family reunion, security? I said get him out. Two more guards rushed forward, but Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick folded stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. He tossed them onto the nearest pristine white table. They landed with a heavy definitive smack next to a plate of untouched caviar. "I'm not a mechanic anymore, Damien," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing through the silent room like thunder. "I'm the primary stakeholder of Apex Capital, the proxy firm that bought your debt 3 years ago to save you from bankruptcy." The color drained instantly from Damien's face. He looked like he had been struck with a baseball bat. Arthur took another step forward, closing the distance, towering over the billionaire. "You just gave away the COO position to your mistress," Arthur said, his voice deadly quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. "Which is a shame, because as the man who currently owns 82% of your voting shares, I'm firing you both." 82%. The number seemed to hang in the air, a physical object suspended above the caviar and the crystal. The dead silence in the St. Regis ballroom finally snapped, replaced not by a roar, but by a frantic collective hissing. It was the sound of 100 wealthy self-preservationist minds recalculating their allegiances in real time. Damien stared at the stack of papers on table 1, the heavy black clip digging into the crisp white linen. He didn't reach for them. To touch them would make them real. "You're out of your mind," Damien said. His voice was a thin, reedy thing stripped of all its previous baritone resonance. He looked around, a frantic twitch developing under his left eye. "This is a stunt. Security, I gave you an order escort this lunatic out of my hotel." The guards didn't move. They looked at Damien, then looked at the older man in the steel-toed boots, and finally at the ruddy-faced executive sitting at table 1, who was suddenly leaning very closely over the legal documents. "Damien," the executive said, his voice stripped of the sycophantic warmth he had used 10 minutes prior. He pushed his half-eaten scallops aside. "He's not lying. This is the Apex acquisition portfolio. I'm looking at the notarized transfer of debt." The executive looked up, his eyes hard and completely void of loyalty. "He owns the paper, Damien. He owns us." Damien took a step backward, his heel catching on the edge of the carpet. He stumbled just a fraction of an inch, but in a room that dealt in the currency of absolute control, it was a fatal plummet. Chloe stood up from her chair. The emerald silk suddenly looked cheap under the harsh glare of the chandelier. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she managed to speak. This is ridiculous. You can't fire the CEO. We just closed a multi-million-dollar merger. The board, the board." Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping like an anvil. "Answers to the majority shareholder, and I don't like the way he runs my company." Arthur didn't look at Chloe. He didn't consider her a threat. She was a symptom. Damien was the disease. Arthur kept his pale, flinty eyes locked on Damien, watching the billionaire mentally scramble for a life raft. Kate sat frozen. The heavy sapphire silk of her gown felt like a straitjacket pressing into her lungs. The smell of roasted truffles from the untouched plates suddenly turned her stomach, mixing with the sharp, acidic tang of her own adrenaline. She looked at her father, Arthur Reynolds, a man who spent 30 years running a regional construction empire, wearing the same canvas jackets and driving the same battered Ford. He had sold the business 5 years ago, retiring to a quiet cabin in upstate New York. He had told Kate he was investing the capital. He had never told her he was buying the very debt her husband was racking up to fund his reckless, ego-driven expansions. "Dad," Kate whispered again, Her voice cracked. It was a pathetic, raw sound. Arthur's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at her. "Get your coat, Kate," he said quietly. "We're leaving." "No!" Damien barked, the sudden panic breaking his polished veneer. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of table 1. His knuckles turned bone white. "She's not going anywhere. This is a misunderstanding. Sir Arthur, we can talk about this. In private. Away from the press." Damien gestured frantically toward the back of the room where the flashes of camera phones were already beginning to strobe through the dim lighting. The murmurs had escalated to a chaotic buzz. The story of the decade was unfolding over a plate of cold appetizers. "There's a VIP room behind the stage." Damien pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate hiss. The smell of his sweat cut through the Tom Ford cologne, sour metallic fear. "Please, let's just talk, man to man. Don't do this in front of them." Arthur looked at the sea of hungry, calculating faces. He looked at the phones recording them. He hated this world. He hated the sterile, performative cruelty of it. But mostly, he hated the hollowed-out look in his daughter's eyes. "Fine," Arthur said, his jaw tightening. 5 minutes. Arthur walked around the table and offered his hand to Kate. His palm was rough, mapped with decades of calluses and scarred tissue. Kate looked down at it. Her own hands were shaking uncontrollably. She placed her cold, manicured fingers into his. The warmth of his grip was a shock to her system. It was real. It was grounded. She stood up. The boning in her corset pinched her ribs, a sharp reminder of the armor she had put on for a man who had just publicly tried to execute her dignity. Damien didn't wait for them. He spun on his heel and power-walked toward the heavy velvet curtains behind the stage, pushing past the confused caterers. Chloe hesitated for a split second, looking at the board members who were pointedly ignoring her, before lifting her silk hem and scurrying after Damien like a frightened shadow. Kate let her father lead her. As they passed the ruddy-faced executive, the man stood up slightly. "Kate, if there's anything you need..." Kate didn't stop. She didn't look at him. She tasted the stale champagne on her tongue and swallowed it down, walking past the people who 10 minutes ago were perfectly content to watch her drown. The VIP room smelled of ozone, fresh paint, and floor wax. It was a stark contrast to the gardenias in the ballroom. It was a staging area completely devoid of charm, with harsh fluorescent tubes buzzing aggressively overhead. Damien was pacing the length of a cheap folding table when Kate and Arthur walked in. The heavy sound of the velvet curtain falling shut behind them cut off the noise of the ballroom, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in the small room. Okay, Damien breathed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the part. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, suddenly looking claustrophobic. "Let's be rational, Arthur. I had no idea you were behind Apex. If I had known, you would have hidden the rot better," Arthur finished for him. He didn't sit down. He stood squarely in the center of the room, an immovable object. "Your books are a mess, Damien. You leveraged assets you didn't own to buy tech firms you didn't need all to look good for Forbes. I bought your debt because I knew you were going to crash, and I wasn't going to let you take my daughter down with the ship. I am building an empire." Damien snapped his ego, flaring up a defensive reflex. "You build warehouses, Arthur. You don't understand the tech sector. You have to spend aggressive capital to establish dominance. You spent capital on chartered jets and a mistress," Arthur said, flatly. The words hit the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. Chloe, who had been hovering near the door, flinched. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Damien and I have a real connection," She piped up her voice, trembling slightly desperate to maintain her footing in the shifting sand. It's not just an affair. We are partners in business and— "Shut up, Chloe," Damien snapped. He didn't yell it. He hissed it, not even looking at her. It was an absent, reflexive dismissal. Chloe physically recoiled, her eyes widening in shock. The man who had just handed her a C-suite position on a silver platter had cut her down with 3 words. Kate watched the exchange. She felt a strange, terrifying hollowness behind her ribs. There were no tears. The searing, blinding rage she expected never materialized. Instead, she felt like she was watching a documentary about insects. Cold, analytical, and entirely detached. "Damien," Kate spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Damien's head snapped toward her. His eyes were wild, searching her face for the familiar, accommodating wife he had trained her to be. He took a step toward her, his expression twisting into something approximating vulnerability. "Kate, please," he said, reaching out. "You know how I get. The pressure, the bored. I was stressed. The things I said out there, I was just playing the game. You know I need you." Kate looked at his outstretched hand. She remembered a time when she would have grabbed it like a lifeline. She remembered the cramped office over the dry cleaner, the smell of cheap takeout, the way he used to look at her when they closed their first $10,000 contract. "You didn't play a game, Damien," Kate said, slowly, tasting the reality of the words as they left her mouth. "You showed them who you are, and you showed me." "I can fix it," Damien urged, stepping closer, ignoring her father, who stood between them like a concrete pillar. "Arthur, look, we keep this quiet. I stay on as CEO. I'll give you a board seat. We restructure. I'll cut the bloated departments. I'll even—" He shot a fast, ruthless glance back at Chloe. "I'll rescind the COO offer. Chloe goes back to her old firm. Clean slate. We're family Arthur." A choked, pathetic sob escaped Chloe's throat. She backed away from him, pressing her spine against the cheap drywall. She was suddenly realizing that to a shark, everyone is just meat. Arthur let out a low, rough sigh. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple brass key. He tossed it onto the folding table. It clattered sharply against the plastic. "That's the key to the Vanguard executive elevator," Arthur said. "You won't be needing it tomorrow. My lawyers will be at your office at 8 a.m. You will sign the severance papers, or I will initiate an immediate audit of your discretionary spending for the last 4 years. And based on what I've seen, that audit ends with you in federal court." Damien stopped breathing. His mouth hung slightly open. The bluster, the arrogance, the media-ready charm, it all dissolved, leaving a terrified, hollow shell of a man. "You can't do this to me," Damien whispered, the reality finally cracking through his skull. "I built Vanguard. It's my name on the door." "It was her brains," Arthur corrected, nodding toward Kate. "And my money. You were just the suit we put out front. The suit got dirty. Now we're throwing it away." Arthur turned his back on Damien. A supreme insult in the corporate world. He looked at Kate. "Are you ready?" Kate looked at Damien one last time. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring blindly at the brass key on the table, his chest heaving under his tailored shirt. He looked small, pitiful. "Yes," Kate said. "I'm ready." She didn't offer a dramatic parting word. She didn't slap him. She just turned around and walked toward the heavy velvet curtain. "Kate," Damien called out, his voice cracking violently. "Kate, you leave now. You get nothing. The prenup is ironclad. You'll have nothing." Kate paused at the curtain. She didn't turn around. She placed her hand on the heavy, dusty fabric. "I already have nothing, Damien," she said to the wall. "I'm just finally leaving it behind." She pushed the fabric aside and walked out. The walk through the service corridor of the St. Regis was a sensory shock. Gone were the plush carpets and the smell of expensive floral arrangements. Here it was cracked linoleum, the heavy hum of industrial refrigerators, and the sharp scent of bleach and hot dishwater. Kate walked beside her father. The heavy sapphire dress dragged against the dirty floor, picking up grime, but she didn't care. She wanted it ruined. She wanted every piece of this night utterly destroyed. They pushed through the heavy metal exit doors and stepped out into the loading dock behind the hotel. The November air hit her like a physical blow. It was freezing, carrying the damp metallic smell of city rain and exhaust fumes. Kate shivered violently, her bare arms immediately erupting in goosebumps. Without a word, Arthur stopped. He unbuttoned his heavy canvas jacket, shrugging out of it. He wrapped it around Kate's shoulders. The jacket was massive on her. It smelled of sawdust, old leather, and peppermint gum. It was heavy rough against the delicate skin of her collarbone, and it was the best thing she had felt in a decade. She pulled the lapels tight across her chest, burying her face into the collar. "My truck is in the alley." Arthur grunted, pointing toward the mouth of the brick corridor where the streetlights bled a sickly orange glow onto the wet asphalt. They walked in silence. The heavy thud of Arthur's boots echoed off the brick walls, accompanied by the quiet rustle of Kate's silk dress and the soft slap of her heels. As they reached the edge of the alley, a sudden burst of blinding white light assaulted them. "Mr. Vanguard, over here." Is it true about the hostile takeover? A dozen paparazzi had figured out the service exit. They were clustered around the mouth of the alley, cameras raised flashes, exploding like lightning in the damp night. Kate flinched, holding up a hand to shield her eyes. The canvas jacket slipped off her shoulder. Suddenly, the heavy metal door of the loading dock slammed open again. Damien burst out into the cold air. He had lost his suit jacket. His tie was loosened, hanging crookedly around his neck. He looked frantic, his eyes reflecting the harsh white flashes of the cameras. He saw the press, and then he saw Kate and Arthur. Instinct kicked in. The survival mechanism of a man who only knew how to exist if an audience was watching. He charged toward them, stopping just short of the camera's glare, angling his body so the press could see his profile. "Kate!" Damien shouted over the cacophony of the reporters. He reached out his hand, hovering near her elbow, trying to project the image of a desperate, heartbroken husband trying to hold on to his erratic wife. "Kate, honey, please. You're not well. Let me take you home. The doctor said you shouldn't be under this kind of stress." It was a brilliant, disgusting pivot. He was laying the groundwork. The crazy wife. The mental breakdown. If he was losing the company, he was going to save his reputation by making her the unstable variable. The cameras clicked furiously, eating it up. Kate stopped. The cold wind whipped a stray strand of hair across her face. She looked at Damien, really looked at him. She saw the calculation in his pale blue eyes, the way his jaw was set for the cameras. She looked down at her hand. She was still holding the small, square napkin she had picked off table 1 right before they walked to the VIP room. A heavy linen cocktail napkin embossed with the Vanguard logo. A memory flared. A cramped apartment, a space heater buzzing in the corner. Damien young and hungry, drawing a ridiculous org chart on a paper napkin while she calculated the math in the margins. "We're going to build a fortress, Kate." She looked at the linen napkin in her hand. Slowly, deliberately, Kate reached into the breast pocket of her father's canvas jacket. She pulled out a thick black Sharpie, a carpenter's marker. Arthur never went anywhere without one. She uncapped it with her teeth, spitting the plastic cap onto the wet asphalt. "Kate, what are you doing?" Damien hissed, his fake smile straining at the edges. "Stop it! Get in the car!" Kate didn't answer. She pressed the heavy linen napkin against the brick wall of the alley. She pressed the thick black marker against the Vanguard logo. She didn't write a manifesto. She didn't write a curse. She just drew a single thick, heavy black line straight through the center of the Vanguard name. A cancellation. A void. She capped the marker with a sharp snap. She turned and stepped right up to Damien. He flinched, stepping back, expecting her to hit him. Instead, she reached out and shoved the defaced linen napkin directly into the breast pocket of his expensive wrinkled dress shirt. "Here," Kate said, her voice carrying clearly over the snapping of the cameras. The night air was biting, but she finally felt warm. "That's your new business plan." Damien stared down at the black line bleeding into his white shirt. For the first time all night, he had absolutely nothing to say. The cameras fired a blinding barrage of flashes, capturing the ruined billionaire and the black ink spreading across his chest. Kate turned away from the light. She adjusted her father's heavy canvas coat on her shoulders, sinking into the smell of sawdust and leather. "Let's go home, Dad," she said. Arthur grunted a sound of deep, resonant approval. He placed a heavy hand on her back, guiding her toward the battered, mud-splattered Ford F-15, parked at the end of the alley. Kate opened the heavy creaking door of the truck. She climbed inside. The vinyl seat was cold and hard. The cabin smelled faintly of stale coffee and dog hair. It was utterly imperfect. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. As Arthur started the engine, it roared to life with a loud, unapologetic rumble that drowned out the shouts of the paparazzi. Kate didn't look out the window as they pulled away from the St. Regis, leaving the champagne, the silk, and the hollow man far behind in the rearview mirror. Rain began to fall just as the city limits bled into the darker, quieter stretch of the highway. The Ford's wipers squealed, dragging across the glass in a rhythmic, agonizing tempo. Rubber against wet glass. Squeak thud. Squeak thud. The sound filled the cab, heavy and hypnotic. Kate stared out the passenger window, watching the slick black road swallow the headlights. The heater roared beneath the dashboard, blowing dry, scorching air against her shins, clashing terribly with the freezing draft leaking through the worn weather stripping of the door. The sapphire dress, which cost more than the truck itself, was crumpled around her thighs, stiff and utterly ridiculous in this environment. The boning in the corset had dug red welts into her ribs. She reached back blindly, fumbling with the tiny silk-covered buttons, desperate to loosen the suffocating grip. But her fingers were numb and clumsy. Arthur noticed. He kept his left hand draped casually over the top of the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the driving rein. He reached over with his right hand, flipping a switch on the console. The heater's roar died down to a manageable rattling hum. "Thermos behind your seat," he grunted, his voice barely rising above the engine noise. Kate twisted her spine, popping in protest. She reached into the dark crevice behind the seat and found a heavy Stanley thermos. The green paint was chipped, revealing dented, scarred steel underneath. She unscrewed the cup, her hand shaking slightly, and poured. It was black burnt and tasted aggressively like metallic diner grounds that had been sitting for 10 hours. It was the most perfect thing she had ever swallowed. The scalding liquid slid down her throat, thawing the icy knot of humiliation that had been sitting in her stomach since Damien told her to go sit down. She wrapped both hands around the steel cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel like a triumphant heroine riding off into the sunset. She felt exhausted. She felt incredibly, profoundly stupid. For 10 years she had poured her own cement to build the pedestal Damien stood on. She had ignored the lingering scent of vanilla perfume in his car. She had justified the emotional starvation, convincing herself that his ambition was a shared asset. She hadn't just been a victim, she had been a willing participant in her own erasure. That realization tasted worse than the stale coffee. "You're thinking too loud," Arthur said, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "I'm thinking about how much of my life I wasted," Kate said, her voice raspy, stripped of the polished, accommodating tone she had used all night at the gala. "You didn't waste it. You spent it learning a very expensive lesson," Arthur replied, flatly. He downshifted as the truck hit an incline, the engine groaning in protest. "Some people buy sports cars. You bought a front row seat to finding out exactly what kind of man you married. Now you know. The tuition is paid. Don't enroll in the class again." Kate let out a short, breathy laugh that caught sharply in her chest. It wasn't funny, but it was true. They drove for another 2 hours in comfortable, heavy silence. The streetlights vanished, entirely replaced by the towering pitch-black silhouettes of the northern pines. The tires finally crunched off the smooth asphalt and onto a rutted gravel driveway, kicking up stones against the undercarriage. Arthur's cabin wasn't a rustic retreat designed for magazines. It was a functional, weather-beaten structure tucked stubbornly against a rocky ridge. The porch boards groaned underfoot as they walked up the steps. A single yellow bulb buzzed near the door frame, swarming with damp moths despite the chill. Inside, the air was dense. It smelled of wood smoke, old newspaper, and wet dog. A massive gray-muzzled hound thumped its tail against a braided rug by the unlit fireplace, too arthritic to bother standing up to greet them. Kate stood in the center of the small living room. She let the heavy canvas jacket slide off her shoulders, falling onto a worn leather armchair. She reached back, finally managing to rip the side zipper of the dress down. She didn't care if the delicate teeth snapped. The heavy sapphire silk pooled at her feet, a shimmering puddle of useless luxury, collapsing onto scuffed hardwood. She stood in her plain cotton slip, shivering, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. Arthur walked past her, his heavy boots tracking mud onto the floorboards. He completely ignored the discarded dress. He didn't offer a hug, and he didn't offer a speech about how proud he was. He went straight to the kitchen, opened a rattling, outdated refrigerator, and pulled out a brown paper bag. "There's a flannel shirt on the bed in the spare room," Arthur said, tossing a cold apple to the hound, who caught it with a lazy snap of its jaws. "Shower takes exactly 5 minutes to heat up. Don't stand in it before then, unless you want to freeze." Kate nodded. She walked to the spare room, her bare feet cold against the floor. The sun came up harsh and blindingly bright, glaring through an uncurtained window. Kate woke up on a mattress that sagged heavily in the middle, wrapped in a thick weighted quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. For a terrible, disorienting fraction of a second, she blindly reached across the bed, her hand expecting to find the cool, high thread count sheets of the penthouse, expecting the distant hum of city traffic. Her knuckles scraped against a coarse wool blanket. Reality rushed back, a cold bucket of water over her head. The gala. The smirk on Chloe's face. The the heavy boots of her father echoing across the marble, the black Sharpie bleeding into the Vanguard logo on Damien's chest. She sat up. Her body ached violently as if she had been in a physical brawl. Her neck was stiff, her ribs tender from the corset, her eyes swollen and dry. She dragged herself out of bed, pulling the oversized worn flannel shirt tighter around her thighs, and walked to the kitchen. Arthur was already at the small, scratched wooden table. He was wearing a faded Henley shirt, reading a physical newspaper, a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. The smell of bacon grease and strong, fresh coffee hung thick in the air. On the kitchen counter, a small square television murmured quietly. Kate stopped in the doorway. The screen displayed a chaotic, shaky video shot from a cell phone outside the St. Regis loading dock. There was Damien caught mid-shout, his face pale and frantic under the brutal glare of camera flashes. A stark, thick black line was violently slashed across the Vanguard logo on his crisp white shirt. The scrolling ticker tape at the bottom of the screen read in bold red letters, Vanguard CEO, Damien Cross ousted in shocking mid-gala boardroom. Coup, majority shareholder seizes control. Stocks plummet 18% in pre-market trading. Arthur didn't look up from his newspaper. He simply reached out with his right hand and slid a heavy ceramic mug across the table. It stopped directly in front of the empty wooden chair opposite him. Kate walked over and sat down. She pulled the mug toward her. It was hot, burning her fingertips slightly, but she didn't let go. She looked at the television screen, watching the man she had loved for a decade scramble frantically to salvage a reputation that no longer existed. Then she looked out the window. Beyond the dirty glass, the pine trees swayed violently in a bitter morning wind. The sky was the color of bruised iron threatening snow. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape. There was no fairy tale ending waiting for her out there. There was a messy public divorce looming. There would be lawyers' depositions, a relentless media circus, and the terrifying, exhausting prospect of having to figure out exactly who she was without the crushing weight of Damien's ambition pressing her down into the dirt. It was going to be brutal. It was going to be lonely. Kate lifted the mug to her lips and took a sip. The coffee was bitter strong and completely unrefined. It tasted like reality. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind rattle the old window panes, the comfortable scratch of her father turning a newspaper page, and for the first time in 10 years, Kate took a full, deep breath. If Kate's raw journey of shattered illusions and brutal payback resonated with you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to support real grounded storytelling. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that sometimes the hardest walks lead to the ultimate freedom. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of our original dramas. Your support keeps these stories alive.